The thing I love most about Poisonous Liaisons is how unique it is as a concept, because I don't think I've ever seen any other TV show that focuses purely on death by poison. And this is really, it's a really detailed show, and there are quite a number of episodes, and each one has several cases in it. So obviously it's done a lot of research, it knows what it's talking about, and for the most part it's fairly well presented. So the only thing that I didn't really like about it is that sometimes the cases were a bit dry, and they were a bit predictable, and because a lot of the cases, just purely because poison was previously more effective, well, not more effective, but more used as a method of murder than it is today, especially because it never used to be detected. A lot of the cases are much older, so we don't have as many, say, bodies found at crime scenes or kind of anything else from the time. It's all just storytelling. But that's interesting, but it just means that every now and then it doesn't capture the attention fully, certainly for some of the more predictable cases. However, I did truly like this, and although some of the cases are dry, there is a really good variety in there. I don't want to spoil too much by kind of saying what a lot of the cases are about, but most of them are familial crimes, so largely it's a husband trying to poison a wife or vice versa to get the life insurance money, or because they're having an affair and they want to get rid of their partner. There were a few other more unique ones though that I thought were really interesting. There were two that stood out to me particularly, and as I said, I won't go into them in too many details, I don't want to ruin it. But there was one about somebody who, look out for the case where they give coconut sweets that are laced with poison. I just thought it was a really interesting case, and the fact that it wasn't really intended murder makes it all the more interesting. And we have testimony from one of the victims, ironically not the intended victim, but just one of them, who was affected by this and how this made her feel. And that's really great, because a lot of these cases, the only real direct victims obviously were murdered, which is awful. So to be able to hear from some people who actually experienced this poison is really interesting. The other case involves a woman who is having an affair with her colleague. They both work in a lab environment and have access to the medicine. And it's a more recent case, quite a recent case. And I just really like the development of that episode, or that part of the episode. I think the story was very well presented and very well told, and definitely made me intrigued enough to go onto Google afterwards and see what if there was any update on that. As I said at the beginning, this documentary knows what it's talking about, and that may sound obvious because it's a documentary, but quite often with true crime, the people presenting it or editing it aren't really that knowledgeable. They've been hired by a TV company to do this work, and that's understandable, and they rely on the interviewees to give the information. But I feel like this one, they definitely know what they're talking about. All the information seems to fit together. There's a lot of detail in this, and even though it's quite heavily scientific based on the nature of poison, it's quite easy to follow. Maybe that's a bad thing, because maybe it will give some people some ideas about poisons and how to poison somebody. But a lot of the time, even when we didn't have the means of showing that up in a toxicology report back then, it will often highlight saying, this would show up now, so, don't kill somebody this way. So if you were thinking of poisoning somebody, although this may actually be able to give you some advice, it will also certainly prove that you better not do that, because it will show up in the tox report and you will get found guilty. So don't poison anybody. But that's always the danger with these shows. It's the same with any true crime show. When they show how maybe somebody got away with something or how the police found them, it gives you tips for what not to do. But that's just the nature of true crime, I guess. This really sounds like I'm planning something sinister. I'm not, I promise. I'm just deeply fascinated by poisons, specifically Victorian era, because obviously it was, as I said, more of a method back then because it didn't show up in tox reports. Indeed, there wasn't really such a thing as a toxicology report back then. It's interesting to see how kind of it's become less usable because it shows up. And, there was another case as well that made me really fascinated. They used a drug from India, I believe. And it's really interesting to kind of work out how they eventually discovered what this was, because obviously if it's a foreign substance, they're not used to kind of seeing this and dealing with it and being able to recognise it. It was really fascinating to see how they came to realise what this was and why it was causing these effects, and then solving the case as well. So it's not just about discovering the poisons, but also how the culprits were caught and how people were found guilty. It's brilliant. It is really amazing. As I said, there were a few dry moments, struggled to hold my attention every now and then, but for the most part, I thought it was really interesting, very fascinating. Nice to have a more historical true crime documentary series that also incorporates more contemporary crimes and showing how a lot of them have never really changed. It's really fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I watched it on Crime and Investigation on Amazon Prime. Absolutely recommend it. There are, I believe, 12 episodes of just under an hour each. So you could watch it in a day if you wanted. Probably wouldn't recommend it, but I'd say maybe I watched about 3 episodes a day. And it's pretty addictive. Kind of sad it's over. Hope we get a second season. But if not, at the very least, the first season of Poisonous Liaisons is pretty enjoyable.